There's a special kind of pain that comes when life strips away everything you thought made you who you are. Eli Carter knew that pain well. At 53, he'd buried his wife, lost his home to her medical bills, and now walked barefoot through abandoned lots looking for scrap metal just to survive another day. Behind the old cannery, he found a rusted cage with 3 German shepherds inside. 2 pressed against the back, afraid and broken, but the smallest one, limping on an injured paw, came forward and pressed against the bars. The pup looked at him with eyes that saw past his empty pockets and worn clothes, choosing him when no one else had in 3 long years. When the owner demanded $1,500, Eli offered his last $23 and the boots. From his feet, what the little dog did next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millfield's empty streets, painting everything in shades of rust and memory. Eli Carter walked slowly down Maple Avenue, his bare feet silent against cracked pavement that once bustled with purpose. The town hadn't died all at once. It had faded gradually, like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. He paused outside Henderson's Hardware, pressing his palm against the dusty window. Inside, shelves still held their ghostly inventory. Screws, sorted by size, paint cans arranged by color, tools that would never again know the satisfaction of honest work. A handwritten sign hung crooked behind the glass. Gone fishing, back Monday. That Monday had come and gone 3 years ago. Eli's reflection stared back at him, and he barely recognized the man looking out from hollow cheeks and graying beard. Construction foreman for 28 years, he'd built half the houses in 3 counties. His hands had shaped wood and steel into homes where families grew old together, where children took their first steps, where Christmas mornings unfolded. In rooms he'd framed with his own calloused fingers. Now those same hands rummaged through other people's discarded dreams, searching for aluminum cans worth a nickel each, copper wire that might fetch $1 at the scrapyard 20 miles south. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd built things now lived by taking them apart. The church bell tower loomed ahead, its bronze bell silent since Reverend Matthews moved to Florida. Eli remembered when that bell called the whole town to Sunday service, when voices rose together in hymns that seemed to hold the community like cupped hands around a candle flame. Mary had sat beside him in the 3rd pew, her voice soft but sure, her hand finding his during the closing prayer. 3 years now since the cancer took her. 3 years since the medical bills devoured their savings, their home, their carefully laid plans for retirement. 3 years since Eli discovered that a lifetime of steady work could vanish as quickly as morning frost under an indifferent sun. He adjusted the worn backpack on his shoulders, feeling the weight of his worldly possessions. A thin blanket that had belonged to his father, a thermos that no longer held heat, a photograph of Mary wrapped in plastic to keep the rain away. At the bottom, carefully folded, lay his last $23, money earned by returning bottles to the redemption center, each one representing someone else's small pleasure discarded. The abandoned lot stretched beyond the railroad tracks, a wasteland of industrial debris where Millfield's cannery once stood. For 37 years, the cannery had provided steady work for anyone willing to show up on time and work hard. Eli had started there at 19, before construction called him away to bigger dreams and better money. Now, the cannery's skeleton, rusted in the weather, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring at nothing. This morning, something felt different. The air carried a weight that made his skin prickle, the way it used to before thunderstorms when he was a boy. His grandmother used to say that sensitive souls could feel when change was coming, could sense the world shifting like tectonic plates beneath their feet. Eli had always dismissed such notions as old woman superstition. He picked his way through scattered bricks and twisted metal, eyes scanning for anything valuable. The scrap dealer, Horace Jennings, would be opening his gates in 2 hours. If Eli could gather enough copper or brass, maybe he could afford a hot meal at Rita's Diner, the only restaurant still open, where the coffee was always too strong and the eggs always too greasy, but where Rita herself would sometimes slide. An extra biscuit onto his plate when she thought no one was looking. A sound stopped him mid-step, soft, almost musical, like wind through bare branches, but with something alive beneath it. He turned slowly, following the sound past a pile of rusted machinery around the corner of a crumbling foundation wall. The cage sat in a small clearing, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Rust had eaten through parts of the metal, but the structure remained solid, prison-strong. Inside, 3 German shepherds huddled together, 2 adults and what looked like a juvenile, maybe 8 months old. Eli's breath caught in his throat. The dog's eyes held a familiar expression, the same hollow resignation he'd seen in his own mirror, the look of creatures who'd learned not to hope too hard for rescue that might never come. Their coats were matted and dirty, their ribs visible, beneath fur that should have been thick and proud. The 2 larger dogs pressed themselves against the far side of the cage, watching him with careful wariness. But the smallest one, barely more than a pup despite its size, limped forward on 3 legs, favoring what looked like an injured front paw. Those eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on his face with an intensity that made Eli's chest tighten. "Hey, there, little one," he whispered, crouching down despite the sharp stones that bit into his knees. "What are you doing way out here?" The pup pressed against the bars, pushing its muzzle through a gap just wide enough to touch Eli's outstretched fingers. The contact sent an electric current up his arm, not painful but startling in its intensity. When had another living thing last chosen to touch him? When had anything looked at him with such complete trust? Behind the pup, the 2 adults watched with increasing interest. The larger of the 2, a magnificent male with traditional black and tan markings, took a tentative step forward. The other, a female with a graying muzzle that spoke of middle age and experience, remained cautious but alert. Eli studied the cage more carefully. It was well constructed, expensive, not something used for strays. A small metal plate near the latch bore an address: Riverside Kennels, Premium German Shepherds. Below that, in smaller letters, Property of Douglas Mencken. The name hit Eli like cold water. Doug Mencken owned half the remaining businesses in Millfield, including the development company that had bought and demolished Eli's house when the medical bills mounted too high to manage. A man who wore success like cologne, whose handshake was firm and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. What was Mencken doing with 3 German shepherds in a cage out here in the ruins? And more importantly, why had he left them? The injured pup whimpered softly, drawing Eli's attention back to those pleading eyes. The sound was barely audible, but it cut through him like a blade. Here was need, without pretense. Vulnerability, without shame. Something pure in a world that had taught him to expect complications in every kindness. Eli looked around the desolate landscape, then back at the 3 pairs of eyes watching him. 3 dogs who needed help. 1 man with $23 and nowhere to go. The math was simple, even if the solution wasn't. The smart thing would be to walk away. Report it to animal control if they still had animal control in a town that could barely afford to keep the streetlights working. Let someone else deal with the responsibility, the expense, the inevitable complications that came with caring for something other than yourself. But the smart thing had stopped feeling like the right thing somewhere along the way. The smart thing was what had kept him safe and solitary for 3 years, what had taught him to take only what he needed and never more, what had convinced him that wanting anything beyond basic survival was a luxury he couldn't afford. The pup pressed harder against the bars, and Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a stirring of something he'd thought was buried with Mary, something that whispered about purpose and belonging and the weight of being needed. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. and looked at the three faces watching him with varying degrees of hope and resignation. The injured pup's tail moved in the smallest possible wag, as if it didn't want to invest too much in optimism but couldn't help itself. "Well," Eli said, softly, his voice rusty from too many days of silence, "I suppose we need to figure this out." The words hung in the morning air like a promise, and for the first time in 3 years, Eli Carter felt the terrifying, exhilarating weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like an old friend coming home. In his pocket, Mary's wedding ring pressed against his fingers, a small circle of gold he'd never been able to bring himself to sell, even when hunger made his stomach ache and cold made his bones feel brittle. She would have understood this moment, would have seen the recognition that passed between damaged souls who chose each other despite impossible odds. The dogs continued watching him, and Eli realized that whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited, he was no longer facing them alone. Eli studied the cage's latch mechanism, his construction-trained mind automatically assessing the problem. The lock was simple but effective, a heavy-duty padlock that looked relatively new despite the rust eating at the cage itself. Someone had secured these dogs deliberately, with intention. The injured pup continued pressing against the bars, its dark eyes never leaving Eli's face. There was something in that gaze that made his chest tight, not just need, but recognition, as if the animal understood somehow that Eli carried his own wounds, his own limp through life's harder terrain. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, extending his fingers through the bars again. The pup's nose was cold and damp against his skin, and when its tongue darted out to lick his fingertips, Eli felt something crack open inside him, a door he'd kept locked for 3 years. Behind the pup, the two adults had crept closer. The male was magnificent despite his circumstances, easily 80 pounds of muscle and intelligence that would have been impressive in better times. His coat showed the classic German shepherd coloring, black saddle over tan legs and chest, though dirt and neglect had dulled its natural luster. The female was smaller, more compact, with a greying muzzle that suggested she was past her prime, but her eyes held a sharp awareness that spoke of experience. A mother, perhaps, or simply a survivor, who'd learned to read situations quickly and adapt accordingly. All three were thin, not starved, but clearly underfed. Water bowls inside the cage were empty, and Eli could see no sign of recent food. How long had they been here? And why had someone who could afford premium breeding stock abandoned them in a forgotten corner of a dying town? The sound of a truck engine made him straighten, instinctively stepping back from the cage. Through the industrial debris, he could see dust rising from the access road that led to the lot. Someone was coming. The dogs sensed it too. The adults pressed themselves against the back of the cage, while the injured pup whimpered and pushed harder against the bars, as if trying to reach the safety Eli represented. A white pickup truck emerged. Through the morning haze, new, expensive, with Mencken Development painted on the driver's door in gold letters. Behind the wheel, Doug Mencken himself, his silver hair perfectly styled even at 7 in the morning, his pressed shirt and tie incongruous in the industrial wasteland. Eli considered retreating, disappearing into the maze of debris before Mencken spotted him. But something in the pup's whimper kept his feet planted. The little dog was shaking now, pressing so hard against the bars that Eli worried it might hurt itself further. Mencken parked 20 feet away and climbed out, his Italian leather shoes picking carefully across the uneven ground. He looked exactly, as Eli remembered, well-fed, confident, with the bearing of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world's hierarchy. "Eli Carter," Mencken said, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a politician at election time. "I heard you were still around. How have you been keeping?" The casual tone might have fooled someone who hadn't sat across from Mencken in the bank 3 years ago, listening to explanations about market conditions and unfortunate circumstances, while watching his life's work reduced to numbers on paper. That didn't add up to enough. "Been better," Eli replied, his voice steady despite the anger simmering in his chest. "These your dogs?" Mencken glanced at the cage as if noticing it for the first time. "Ah, yes. Business venture that didn't quite work out. Thought breeding might be profitable, but turns out there's not much market for working dogs around here anymore." The casual dismissal sent heat up Eli's neck. "So you just left them out here?" "Temporarily," Mencken said quickly, his smile flickering. "I've got buyers coming to look at them this afternoon. Professional outfit from downstate. They'll give them good homes." Behind Mencken, the injured pup pressed harder against the bars, its whimper now barely audible, but somehow more desperate. Eli's hands clenched at his sides. "What about the little one's leg?" Mencken shrugged. "That's why I'm selling them cheap. The buyer knows about the injury, says they can work around it, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implications hung in the air like smoke. "Or what?" "Look, Eli, I'm not running a charity here. These are business assets, and I need to liquidate. The buyer's offering a fair price for the lot, working dogs and damaged goods together." The casual cruelty of it hit Eli like a physical blow. Damaged goods. The pup that had chosen to trust him, that looked at him with such hope despite its pain, was nothing more than damaged goods in Mencken's ledger. "How much?" The words came out before Eli could stop them. Mencken's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me? How much for all three?" A laugh escaped Mencken's throat, not pleasant, but not quite cruel either, just genuinely surprised. "Eli, these aren't strays. Even with the injury, we're talking about $1,500. These are registered German shepherds from championship bloodlines. $1,500. Eli's last $23 felt like pocket change against such a number. But the pup was watching him through the bars, and something in those dark eyes made his chest ache with possibility. "The buyer's really coming today, 2:00. Mencken confirmed, checking his gold watch. "Professional trainers. They'll take good care of them." The lie sat heavy in the morning air. Both men knew what professional trainers meant. People who could evaluate a dog's usefulness in minutes and make hard decisions accordingly. The injured pup wouldn't survive such an evaluation. Eli looked at his bare feet, at the scuffed ground, anywhere but at those 3 pairs of eyes, watching him through rusted bars. $23 against $1,500? A homeless man against a businessman who owned half the town. "I don't have that kind of money," he said finally. "I didn't think so." Mencken's voice carried something that might have been sympathy, if it hadn't been wrapped in satisfaction. "But I appreciate the thought." The injured pup whimpered again, and Eli felt something break inside him. Not like glass shattering, but like ice giving way to spring warmth. He thought of Mary, of how she used to rescue injured birds and nurse them back to health in shoeboxes lined with soft rags. He thought of the home they'd built together, the life Mencken's paperwork had reduced to nothing. He thought of 3 years of walking away from everything that mattered. "I've got $23, he said, his voice stronger now. "And these." He sat down on a chunk of concrete and began unlacing his boots. The only decent footwear he owned, worth perhaps $40 at a thrift store, but priceless to a man who walked miles each day on broken pavement. Mencken stared as Eli pulled off. First one boot, then the other. "What are you doing?" Making an offer. Eli stood, his bare feet already feeling the sharp stones and broken glass that littered the ground. $23 cash and a pair of work boots, for all 3 dogs. That's ridiculous. "These boots are barely worth—" "It's what I have," Eli said simply. "It's everything I have." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the dogs shifting in their cage. Mencken looked at the boots, at Eli's bare feet, at the crumpled bills Eli held out like an offering. For a moment, something flickered across Mencken's face. Not kindness exactly, but perhaps recognition of the weight of such a gesture. Or maybe just calculation, measuring the certainty of immediate payment against the possibility of afternoon buyers who might not show. "They're your responsibility then," Mencken said finally, pocketing the money and boots, with movements that suggested he wanted the transaction finished quickly. Food, vet bills, everything, and I don't want to hear about it if things don't work out. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the cage with efficient movements, then climbed back into his truck without another word. The engine started, with expensive smoothness, and within moments the white pickup was disappearing back down the access road, leaving only dust and silence behind. Eli stood barefoot in the debris, staring at the open cage door. Inside, 3 German shepherds looked back at him, with expressions ranging from hope to wariness, to something that might have been gratitude. The injured pup was the first to move, limping forward on 3 legs but moving with more confidence than Eli had felt in years. It stepped carefully through the cage door and pressed against his leg, its warmth solid and real against his skin. "Well," Eli said softly, reaching down to touch the pup's head. "I suppose we're all in this together now." The first challenge became apparent within minutes. 3 dogs, 1 man, and no plan beyond the certainty that leaving them wasn't an option. Eli crouched beside the open cage, watching as the 2 adult dogs approached the door with careful wariness while the injured pup pressed against his leg like an anchor in uncertain waters. The male emerged first, his black and tan coat catching sunlight as he stepped into the wider world. He was larger than Eli had initially realized, close to 90 pounds of muscle and bone, with the confident bearing of a dog bred for work and intelligence. Despite his circumstances, he carried himself with dignity intact, alert ears scanning their surroundings while keeping Eli in his peripheral vision. The female followed more cautiously, her graying muzzle and careful movements speaking of experience hard-won. She positioned herself between the male and the pup, a protective formation that suggested established relationships, despite whatever circumstances had brought them to this place. Eli studied his new responsibilities, while they studied him. 3 dogs who would need food, water, shelter, and medical attention, especially the pup, whose injured paw needed immediate care. $23 and a pair of boots wouldn't have covered any of that, and now he had exactly nothing except what he could carry and whatever he could find. "First things first," he murmured to the pup, whose dark eyes never left his face. "We need water." The abandoned cannery's infrastructure still functioned in scattered pieces. Eli remembered the old loading dock where workers used to wash down equipment at shift's end. If the pipes hadn't frozen and burst during the hard winter 3 years back, there might still be running water. He started walking slowly across the lot, conscious of his bare feet on the rough ground, but more concerned with keeping the dogs close. The pup stayed pressed against his leg, its 3-legged gait matching his careful steps. The 2 adults followed at a respectful distance, close enough to maintain contact, far enough to retreat if needed. The loading dock sat at the canneries, north side, a concrete platform that had once bustled with trucks and workers and the daily rhythm of honest labor. Now it stood empty except for weeds growing through cracks and the ghost of machinery long since sold for scrap. Eli found the maintenance sink where he'd remembered it, a deep basin built for industrial use. When he turned the handle, rust-colored, water coughed from the tap, then cleared to run clean and cold. The dogs rushed forward at the sound, their thirst overriding caution as they crowded around the basin. Watching them drink, Eli felt a mixture of satisfaction and growing anxiety. Water was solved for the moment, but food would be a different challenge entirely. Rita's diner wouldn't feed 3 large dogs, and even if she would, Eli had no money to pay for such kindness. The pup finished drinking and looked up at him with what seemed like gratitude, water dripping from its chin. The simple act of providing for another creature's need awakened something in Eli that had been dormant for too long. The satisfaction of usefulness, of being needed for something more than just surviving another day. "What am I going to call you 3? He asked, settling onto the concrete platform while the dogs explored their immediate surroundings. The male was already marking territory with methodical precision, while the female investigated every corner and shadow with professional thoroughness. The pup sat beside him, its injured paw held carefully off the ground. Close up, Eli could see that the injury was old enough to have partially healed, but not recent enough to be properly treated. The paw sat at an odd angle, suggesting broken bones that had set incorrectly. It would always be a weakness, always require accommodation. "Damaged goods," Eli said softly, remembering Mencken's casual dismissal. "That's what he called you, but you're not, are you?" The pup's tail thumped once against the concrete, and Eli felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. When had anyone looked at him with such uncomplicated acceptance? Even Mary, in her final months, had carried worry in her eyes, concern for his future, anxiety about leaving him alone, love complicated by the practical realities of cancer and medical bills and time running out. This pup looked at him and saw nothing more complicated than someone who had chosen not to walk away, someone who had given everything he had because it needed giving. The male dog returned from his territorial survey and sat at a careful distance, watching Eli with intelligent evaluation. His coat showed breeding in every line, the correct proportions, the alert ears, the confident way he carried himself despite hunger and neglect. This was a working dog, bred for intelligence and loyalty and the satisfaction of having jobs to do. "You're going to need names," Eli told them. "Can't keep calling you the big one and the female one and the little injured one." The female had completed her reconnaissance and now approached more closely, her movement suggesting cautious acceptance. Her graying muzzle and the wisdom in her eyes reminded Eli of his grandmother, a woman who had weathered the Great Depression and 2 wars, who had known hardship but never let it break her spirit. "Grace," he said, looking at the female, "you remind me of someone who faced hard times with dignity intact." Grace tilted her head as if considering the name, then settled into a lying position that allowed her to watch both the male and the pup while keeping Eli in her peripheral vision. A mother's positioning, whether she'd actually borne puppies or simply carried that protective instinct in her bones. The male was more challenging. He had the bearing of a leader, the confidence that came from good breeding and proper training. But there was something else in his posture, a wariness that spoke of betrayal, of trust broken by circumstances beyond his control. "Marcus," Eli decided. "Strong name for a strong dog. Hope you don't mind that it was my father's name too." Marcus's ears flicked at the sound, and he took a step closer, still cautious, still evaluating, but beginning to accept that this strange, barefoot human might be different from the one who had locked them in a cage and driven away. The pup was easier. Despite its injury, despite whatever hardships had brought it to that cage, it had chosen to trust first and question later. It had pressed its paw through the bars like a handshake offered to a stranger, had looked at Eli with eyes that expected a kindness, because kindness was what it hoped to find in the world. "Hope," Eli said, running his hand gently over the pup's head, "because that's what you are. That's what you gave me when I needed it most." Hope's tail wagged more confidently, and for the first time since Mary's death, Eli felt the weight of purpose settling around him like a familiar coat. These 3 needed him, not just temporarily, not just until something better came along, but genuinely and completely. From his pocket, he pulled out the old thermos, dented, scratched, with a lid that no longer sealed properly. It had been his father's, carried to construction sites for 30 years before Eli inherited it along with the trade. Now, it couldn't keep coffee warm for more than an hour, but it was still watertight enough to serve as a portable bowl. He filled the thermos at the sink and offered it to Hope, who lapped gratefully at the water. It wasn't much, a broken container repurposed for a basic need, but it felt like the beginning of something larger. A system, a family maybe, built from damaged parts that somehow functioned better together than they ever had apart. By the second day, the reality of their situation had crystallized into a series of immediate problems that demanded solutions Eli didn't possess. The dogs had spent the night huddled in the abandoned break room of the cannery's administrative wing, where Eli had managed to create a windbreak using sheets of corrugated metal and cardboard salvaged from empty offices. Grace had claimed the corner nearest the door, positioning herself to monitor both entrances and exits. Marcus chose the opposite corner, creating a diagonal sightline that allowed him to watch the exterior while staying connected to the pack. Hope settled wherever Eli was, usually pressed against his side, the pup's warmth a constant reminder of trust freely given. The morning brought their first visitor. Officer Jennifer Martinez parked her patrol car at the lot's entrance and walked carefully through the debris field, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. She was one of only 2 law enforcement personnel left in Millfield. A woman in her 40s who'd grown up in the town and understood the complexity of problems that had no easy solutions. "Morning, Eli," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "Got a call about activity on private property." Eli stood slowly, his bare feet tender from the previous day's walking. Hope pressed closer to his leg, while Marcus positioned himself. Between the stranger and the pack, Grace remained alert but relaxed, reading the situation with maternal wisdom. "I can't have you camping on private property," Martinez continued, her eyes taking in the makeshift shelter and 3 dogs. "Doug, Mencken owns this lot, and if he complains officially, I'll have to act." "Has he complained?" "Not yet, but he will if it becomes visible enough to affect his interests." She paused, studying Hope's injured paw with the expression of someone who understood that simple solutions rarely existed for complicated problems. "You've got, maybe, 2 weeks before this becomes an issue I can't ignore." 2 weeks. Eli had lived day to day for 3 years, but 2 weeks felt simultaneously like forever and no time at all. 2 weeks to find shelter for 3 dogs and a man with no resources, except determination. "I understand," he told her. Martinez nodded and started to leave, then turned back. "There's a food pantry at the Methodist Church on Thursdays. They don't usually do pet food, but Pastor Williams might be willing to help if you ask direct." After she left, Eli sat on the concrete platform with Hope pressed against his side, watching Marcus and Grace explore their expanded territory. The photograph of Mary, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture, crinkled softly in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out carefully, studying her face in the morning light. She'd been 48 when the cancer finally took her, still beautiful, despite the ravages of chemotherapy and the knowledge that their time was running short. In the picture, taken during their last Christmas together, she wore the red sweater he'd bought her for their 20th anniversary, her smile genuine despite the pain he knew she was hiding. "What would you do, Mary?" he asked softly. "How would you make this work?" Hope's head tilted at the sound of his voice, and Eli realized he'd been speaking aloud to Mary's memory more often since acquiring his new responsibilities. Perhaps because caring for others reminded him of her natural instinct to nurture, to find solutions where others saw only problems. Mary would have started with the immediate needs and worked outward, food first, then shelter, then medical care. For Hope's paw, she would have swallowed her pride and asked for help from people who might be willing to give it. She would have seen resources where Eli saw only obstacles. The walk to Rita's diner took 20 minutes, his bare feet picking carefully across broken pavement and scattered glass. The dogs followed in formation, Marcus ranging ahead to scout for threats, Grace maintaining position to protect Hope, the injured pup staying close to Eli's side with determination that defied its physical limitations. Rita's was already open, the smell of bacon and coffee drifting through the morning air like promises of normalcy. Through the window, Eli could see 3 customers at the counter, the usual morning crowd of retirees nursing coffee and solving the world's problems over eggs and toast. He approached the back door, where Rita sometimes appeared to deal with deliveries or take-out trash. The dogs waited patiently while he knocked, Hope sitting carefully to take weight off the injured paw. Rita opened the door wearing her perpetual frown, her grey hair pulled back in a bun that suggested she'd been working since before dawn. She was 60-something, tough as leather, with the no-nonsense attitude of someone who'd been feeding people for 40 years and understood that kindness and business didn't always align. "Eli," she said, her eyes moving from his face to his. Bare feet to the 3 dogs waiting behind him. "Heard you'd acquired some company." "They needed help," he said simply. Rita studied Hope's injured paw with the practical gaze of someone who'd seen plenty of damaged things trying to get by. "That one needs a vet." "I know. Working on it." She disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a paper bag that smelled like heaven. Leftover biscuits, bacon ends, maybe some rice from yesterday's special. Not enough to sustain 3 large dogs, but enough to get them through another day. "Can't make a habit of this," she said, handing him the bag. "Barely keeping the lights on as it is." "I understand. Thank you." Rita nodded and started to close. The door then paused. "Methodist Church does food pantry on Thursdays. Pastor Williams is good people. Might be worth asking." Back at the cannery, Eli divided the food carefully, making sure Hope got the choicest pieces while ensuring Marcus and Grace received adequate portions. Watching them eat, he felt the same satisfaction he'd once experienced completing a construction project, the deep pleasure of seeing need met through careful planning and hard work. But the arithmetic was inescapable. 3 dogs ate more than one man by a considerable margin, and food wasn't their only expense. Hope's paw required medical attention that would cost hundreds of dollars Eli didn't have. Shelter adequate for winter weather needed materials and tools he couldn't afford. Even basic supplies, collar, leashes, proper bowls, represented investments beyond his current means. The afternoon brought another challenge when Marcus began showing signs of territorial aggression toward a stray cat that had wandered into their area. The behavior wasn't malicious. He was simply establishing boundaries around what he now considered pack territory. But it reminded Eli that these weren't pets adapted to human schedules and limitations. They were working dogs with instincts and needs that demanded structure and purpose. Grace intervened before the situation escalated, placing herself between Marcus and the cat with maternal authority that brooked no argument. The cat departed without incident, but the episode highlighted the complexity of managing pack dynamics in an environment where Eli was simultaneously leader and dependent. As evening approached, Eli found himself studying the surrounding industrial landscape with new eyes. The cannery's break room provided basic shelter, but winter was coming, and the building had no heat, minimal insulation, and structural damage that would worsen with the first serious storm. Hope settled against his side as darkness fell, the pup's trust unwavering despite the uncertainty of their situation. Marcus took first watch at the entrance, while Grace positioned herself to monitor the interior. Without discussion or training, they developed a security routine that spoke to their intelligence and adaptability. In his pocket, Mary's photograph rustled softly as he shifted position. She would have found a way, he told himself. She would. Have seen possibilities where he saw only problems, would have turned obstacles into stepping stones through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were together, a pack formed from mutual need and sustained by the simple certainty that they belonged to each other, regardless of what came next. The first serious cold snap arrived on the 6th day, bringing with it a crystalline clarity that made every breath visible and turned the cannery's concrete floors into sheets of ice. Eli woke to find Hope shivering, despite being pressed against his side, the pup's injured paw drawn up tight against its body for warmth. Marcus and Grace had positioned themselves to create a windbreak around the smaller dog, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The makeshift shelter of corrugated metal and cardboard provided minimal protection against temperatures that had dropped below freezing during the night. Eli's bare feet ached with cold as he stood, each step on the concrete sending sharp needles of pain up his legs. His toes had turned an alarming shade of blue-white, and he could barely feel them. despite the urgent signals of distress his nerves were sending. Walking 12 miles to neighboring towns for supplies would be impossible in this condition. But worse than his own discomfort was the sight of Hope struggling to stand, the pup's injured paw clearly stiffened by the cold. What had been a manageable limp in warmer weather now seemed to cause genuine pain with each tentative step. "We need better shelter," he told the dogs, his voice creating puffs of vapor in the frozen air. "And we need it today." The cannery's main building offered possibilities. Most of the structure had been stripped for salvage, but the old office complex still had sections with intact roofing and walls. If Eli could find materials to block the broken windows and create some kind of insulation, they might survive the winter in relative comfort. He spent the morning exploring the building's remains, his bare feet leaving bloody prints on frosted concrete as he searched for usable materials. In what had once been the personnel office, he found a wooden cross carved from oak. Simple but beautifully crafted, probably left behind by some long-departed worker who'd kept it on their desk. The cross was small enough to fit in his palm, worn smooth by years of handling. Someone had carved initials into the base. J.M. Faith is the anchor. Eli didn't consider himself a religious man, but something about the inscription resonated in the cold morning air. Faith as an anchor, not passive hoping, but active trust that holding fast would somehow lead to better outcomes. He slipped the cross into his pocket alongside Mary's photograph and continued his search. The break room adjoining the office had potential: 3 walls intact, a partially functional ceiling, and windows that could be covered rather than replaced. If he could move their makeshift camp here, they'd have better protection from wind and weather. The challenge was materials. The scattered debris around the cannery provided some options: sheets of metal for wind barriers, cardboard for insulation, even some old furniture that could serve as elevated sleeping platforms to get them off the cold floor. But proper weatherproofing required resources he didn't have. By midday, the temperature had risen enough to make movement less painful, though Eli's feet remained dangerously numb. He'd wrapped them in torn fabric from his shirt, but the makeshift protection did little against rough concrete and scattered debris. The walk to town took twice as long as usual, the dogs moving slowly to accommodate Hope's worsening limp. At the Methodist church, Pastor Williams was preparing for the weekly food pantry, carrying boxes from the basement storage room to tables set up in the fellowship hall. Williams was a man in his 60s, thin and angular, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades helping people through their worst moments. He looked up as Eli approached, taking in the bare feet, the 3 dogs, and the desperation that probably showed, despite Eli's attempts to maintain dignity. "Heard you were caring for some animals," Williams said, setting down his box and extending a hand. "I'm David Williams, Eli Carter. Officer Martinez mentioned you might have some advice." Williams studied Hope's injured paw with the gentle attention of someone accustomed to seeing suffering. "That one needs medical care." "I know. Working on it." "What about the others?" "They look healthy enough. Just thin. They eat better than I do most days," Eli said. Which was true. He'd been saving the choicest scraps for the dogs, subsisting on whatever remained after ensuring their needs were met. Williams nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The food pantry doesn't usually handle pet supplies, but we've got some donations that might help. People clean out their garages. Sometimes they bring things we can't use for the regular pantry." He led Eli to a storage area behind the fellowship hall, where boxes of miscellaneous donations waited for sorting or disposal. Among the usual collection of outdated clothing and broken household items, Eli found treasures: a bag of dog food that was only slightly past its expiration date, some old blankets that smelled musty but would provide insulation, even a small space heater that might work if he could find a power source. "Take what you need," William said. "But Eli—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Winter's coming hard this year. That cannery building won't keep you alive if we get the kind of cold snap they're predicting." "I know," Eli said. "We'll figure something out." Williams reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "Dr. Sarah Chen runs a veterinary clinic over in Riverside. Good woman. Tell her I sent you. See if she'll work with you on payment for the injured one." Back at the cannery, Eli began the process of relocating their camp to the more protected office space. The dogs seemed to understand the necessity, helping by carrying smaller items in their mouths, while Eli dragged the heavier materials across the debris-strewn floor. The space heater was a godsend, even though he could only run it for short periods. To conserve the building's limited electrical capacity, the warmth it provided allowed Hope to move more freely, the injured paw loosening as circulation improved. As evening approached, Eli arranged their new shelter with the methodical care of someone who understood that small details could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The blankets created layers of insulation against the concrete floor. The metal sheets formed windbreaks that channeled cold air away from their sleeping area. The space heater, positioned carefully to avoid fire hazards, provided just enough warmth to take the deadly edge off the night air. Hope settled beside him, with obvious relief, the pups breathing easier now that the injured paw could rest without contact with frozen concrete. Marcus and Grace took their usual positions, but both seemed more relaxed in the improved shelter. In his pocket, the wooden cross pressed against the photograph of Mary, two talismans from different sources but carrying similar messages about faith, endurance, and the power of holding fast during difficult times. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the metal sheets and sending cold drafts through gaps in their defenses. But they were together, and they were alive. And tomorrow would bring new possibilities for the pack that had chosen each other against all reasonable odds. The arithmetic of their situation remained challenging. 3 dogs, winter approaching, medical needs unmet, and resources nearly exhausted. But something had shifted in Eli's thinking, a recognition that faith might indeed serve as an anchor, providing stability while he figured out how to navigate towards safer waters. The dogs slept more peacefully that night, and for the first time in a week, Eli allowed himself to hope that they might actually survive whatever came next. The discovery came by accident, the way most life-changing moments do, quietly, without fanfare, hidden in the mundane details of daily survival. Eli was cleaning Mary's old thermos at the cannery's maintenance sink, trying to scrape away years of coffee stains and neglect, when he noticed that the bottom felt heavier than it should. He'd carried the thermos for 3 years without questioning its weight, accepting it as another broken piece of his former life that he couldn't quite bring himself to discard. But now, with water sloshing around inside the dented container, something rattled in a way that didn't match the usual sound of a loose component. The bottom of the thermos had a false panel, so well integrated into the original design that it appeared to be part of the normal construction. Eli might never have noticed it if the cold hadn't caused the metal to contract slightly, revealing a hairline gap that hadn't been visible in warmer weather. Working carefully with a piece of bent wire, he managed to pry up the panel. Inside, wrapped in plastic and protected from moisture, were documents he'd never seen before. Insurance papers, bank statements, and a letter in Mary's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before her death. His hands shook as he unfolded the letter, water from the thermos dripping onto the concrete floor, while Hope pressed against his leg with instinctive concern for his sudden distress. "My darling Eli," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you found my secret hiding place, which probably means things have gotten bad enough that you're looking for answers in all the wrong places. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I know you too well to think you'd go through my things unless you were desperate." The handwriting was shaky. Mary's coordination had been failing during her final weeks, but the words were clear and purposeful, written with the deliberation of someone who knew she was running out of time to say important things. "I took out a small life insurance policy 3 years before I got sick. Nothing big, just $3,000. but I paid the premiums faithfully and never. Told you because I knew you'd argue about the expense. You always said we needed every dollar for the present, never for some hypothetical future. But I needed to know that if something happened to me, you'd have something to fall back on. Eli's vision blurred as he continued reading. The insurance company was Midwest Mutual, and according to the documentation, the policy remained in force as long as the death certificate had been properly filed. Mary had even included contact information and policy numbers, everything needed to file a claim. I know you, Eli Carter. I know you'll blame yourself for things that weren't your fault, and I know you'll try to carry everyone else's burdens, because that's who you are. But sometimes you need to let yourself be helped too. This money isn't much, but it might be enough to give you a new start when you're ready to stop punishing yourself for surviving when I couldn't. The letter continued for another page, filled with memories and encouragement and the kind of practical wisdom Mary had always possessed. But Eli couldn't focus on the words because his mind was racing through possibilities he hadn't dared consider. $3,000. Enough for veterinary care for Hope's injured paw. Enough for proper shelter, warm clothes, maybe even a small apartment if he could find someone willing to rent to a man with 3 dogs and an uncertain employment situation. Marcus and Grace had approached during his reading, sensing his emotional state and positioning themselves protectively around him and Hope. The pack had learned to respond to his moods, understanding somehow that his well-being affected their security. But the insurance claim wouldn't be simple. Eli had no fixed address, no phone number, no way to receive official correspondence or meet with company representatives. He'd been invisible to the bureaucratic world for 3 years, existing in the spaces between official records and governmental awareness. The walk to the public library took 45 minutes, his bare feet leaving bloody prints on sidewalks that had turned treacherous with patches of ice. The dogs followed in their usual formation, drawing stares from the few people brave enough to venture outside in the worsening weather. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, remembered Eli from his previous life when he'd occasionally brought Mary to check out books during her treatment. She looked startled by his appearance, but maintained professional courtesy as he explained his need to use the computer and telephone. "Of course," she said, glancing at Hope's injured paw with obvious concern. "Take as long as you need." The insurance company's customer service line put him through a maze of automated menus before connecting him with a claims representative who sounded like she was reading from a script. Yes, the policy was still active. Yes, death benefits could be paid to surviving spouses. No, the claim couldn't be processed without proper documentation and verification of identity. "I'll need you to come into our office," the representative explained. "You'll need to provide a death certificate, proof of marriage, current identification, and a fixed address where we can send the settlement check." "I don't have a fixed address right now," Eli admitted. "Then you'll need to establish one before we can process the claim. Company policy requires verification of recipient identity and location for settlements over $1,000. The bureaucratic requirements felt insurmountable. How could he establish an address without money to rent a place? How could he access official documents when he had no permanent location to receive mail? The system seemed designed for people who already had stability, not for those desperately trying to achieve it. Mrs. Henderson had been listening discreetly from her desk, and she approached as Eli hung up the phone with obvious frustration. "Sounds like you're dealing with red tape," she said kindly. "They want me to have an address before they'll give me the money I need to get an address," Eli explained. "Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church sometimes lets people use the church address for official mail," she suggested. "Might be worth asking." The conversation with Williams was easier than expected. The pastor had dealt with similar situations before, people caught between bureaucratic requirements and practical realities, needing temporary solutions to permanent problems. "Use the church address," Williams offered without hesitation. I'll hold any mail that comes, and you can pick it up whenever convenient. We've done this before for folks transitioning between situations. The paperwork took 3 days to assemble. Williams helped locate Mary's death certificate from county records. The marriage license required a trip to the courthouse that left Eli's feet bloodier than ever. His identification had expired, necessitating another bureaucratic maze to obtain. And current documents. But gradually, piece by piece, the claim package came together. Hope's condition worsened during the waiting period, the pup increasingly reluctant to put weight on the injured paw as cold weather aggravated the improperly healed bones. On the 4th day, as Eli prepared to mail the completed claim, Hope collapsed outside the cannery entrance. The pup had been trying to follow Marcus on his morning territorial patrol when the injured leg simply gave out, sending Hope tumbling onto the frozen ground with a cry of pain that made Eli's chest tighten with helpless rage. Grace immediately positioned herself protectively over the fallen pup while Marcus stood guard, both adults recognizing that their youngest member was in genuine distress. Hope tried repeatedly to stand, each attempt resulting in whimpers that spoke of pain beyond the injured paw's usual discomfort. "We're going to fix this," Eli promised, kneeling beside Hope despite the sharp cold of the concrete against his knees. "I don't know how long it'll take, but we're going to get you the help you need." The pup looked at him with trust that remained unshaken despite the pain, and Eli felt the weight of that faith settle around him like armor against whatever bureaucratic battles lay ahead. The insurance claim took 2 weeks to process. 2 weeks, during which Hope's condition deteriorated from manageable discomfort to visible suffering. The pup had stopped attempting to walk more than a few steps, preferring to drag itself along the ground rather than put weight on the injured paw. The sight of such determination paired with such obvious pain created a constant ache in Eli's chest. Marcus and Grace had adapted their behavior to accommodate Hope's limitations, shortening their patrol routes and positioning themselves to provide physical support when the pup attempted to move. The pack's dynamics had shifted to protect their most vulnerable member, a display of loyalty that reminded Eli daily of what was at stake. The call from Midwest Mutual came on a Tuesday morning when ice covered everything in a crystalline shell that made the world look beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson at the library had become accustomed to Eli's daily visits to check for messages, and she waved him toward the phone with an expression that suggested good news. "Mr. Carter, this is Janet Morrison from Midwest Mutual. I'm calling about claim number MM47291. Your documentation has been approved, and we're prepared to issue settlement payment in the amount of $3,000. The words hit Eli like electricity. After 3 years of scraping by on daily survival, $3,000 felt like a fortune, enough to transform everything about their situation from desperate to manageable. "The check will be mailed to the address you provided," Morrison continued. "You should receive it within 5 business days. 5 more days. Hope could survive 5 more days, especially if Eli could arrange immediate veterinary attention with the promise of payment upon receipt of the settlement. Dr. Sarah Chen's clinic in Riverside was a 25-mile journey that would have been impossible for Hope to walk, but Pastor Williams had a solution. The church owned an aging pickup truck used for food pantry deliveries, and Williams volunteered to drive them to the appointment Eli had scheduled after explaining the insurance situation. "Sometimes faith requires practical action," Williams said, as they loaded Hope into the truck's cab while Marcus and Grace rode in the bed. "God provides opportunities, but we still have to walk through the doors." Dr. Chen was a compact woman in her 40s, with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd learned to make quick assessments and decisive recommendations. Her clinic smelled of antiseptic and animal fur, with examination rooms that spoke of years spent helping creatures who couldn't explain their pain in words. She examined Hope with gentle thoroughness, her hands probing the injured paw while the Pup lay still with the patience that comes from chronic discomfort. Her expression grew increasingly serious as the examination progressed. The bones healed incorrectly. She confirmed what Eli had suspected. There's significant arthritis developing, and the alignment is causing stress on other joints. Without surgery, this pup will be in increasing pain for the rest of its life. What would surgery involve? Eli asked, though he dreaded the answer. We'd need to re-break the bones and reset them properly, then install pins to maintain correct alignment during healing. Recovery would take 6 to 8 weeks with restricted movement and physical therapy. Total cost would be around $2,200, including follow-up care, $2,200 against $3,000. It would leave $800 for everything else: shelter, food, warm clothing, basic necessities for rebuilding a life. But Hope would be pain-free, able to run and play and live without the constant accommodation required by the improperly healed injury. I can do the surgery next week if you can guarantee payment, Dr. Chen offered. Pastor Williams vouched for you, and I'm willing to work with the insurance timeline. Yes, Eli said without hesitation. Do whatever Hope needs. The ride back to Millfield was quiet, except for Hope's soft breathing from the front seat, where the pup lay with its head on Eli's lap. Marcus and Grace remained alert in the truck bed, their eyes scanning the landscape with the vigilance of dogs who understood that their pack was vulnerable during transport. Williams dropped them at the cannery as afternoon shadows lengthened. Across the industrial landscape, the settlement check would arrive by Friday, the surgery was scheduled for Monday, and for the first time in 3 years, Eli had a plan that extended beyond daily survival. That evening, as they settled into their improved shelter in the old office, Eli read Mary's letter again by the light of the small space heater. Her words seemed different now that they'd proven prophetic, not just the insurance money, but her understanding of his character, his tendency to care for others at his own expense. Sometimes you need to let yourself be helped too, she'd written, and Eli was beginning to understand what that meant. Not just accepting charity, but recognizing that his willingness to sacrifice everything for 3 abandoned dogs had somehow earned him the right to use resources Mary had quietly set aside for exactly this kind of emergency. Hope slept more peacefully that night, perhaps sensing that relief was coming, or maybe just responding to the change in Eli's demeanor. The weight of hopelessness had lifted, replaced by the focused energy that came with having a clear objective and the means to achieve it. Outside, wind rattled their metal windbreaks and sent cold drafts through gaps in their defenses. But inside, their shelter, warmed by the space heater and insulated by salvaged blankets, the pack rested with the security that comes from knowing tomorrow would bring solutions rather than just new problems to endure. The insurance money wouldn't solve everything. They still needed permanent shelter, stable income, and long-term security. But it provided something more valuable than financial resources. It proved that Mary's love had extended beyond her death, that her careful planning had created possibilities Eli couldn't have imagined during his darkest moments. Marcus took first watch, while Grace positioned herself to monitor Hope's breathing. The pack's routine had become second nature, a display of mutual dependence that reminded Eli daily why he'd given up everything to prevent their separation. In his pocket, the wooden cross and Mary's photograph rested together, symbols of faith. From different sources, but carrying the same message about perseverance, hope, and the power of love to transcend seemingly impossible circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were together, and help was finally within reach. The insurance check arrived on Friday morning, delivered to Pastor Williams' office in an envelope that felt impossibly light for something that represented such transformation. Williams handed it over with the solemnity of someone who understood they were witnessing a turning point, not just in Eli's circumstances, but in his fundamental relationship with hope itself. $3,000, Eli said, staring at the numbers printed in official typeface. After years of counting nickels and dimes, the amount seemed abstract, more concept than reality. Mary knew what she was doing, Williams observed, planned for this day, even when you couldn't imagine it would come. Along with the check came another letter from Mary, this one shorter but no less meaningful. She'd written it as a follow-up to her longer message, apparently anticipating that Eli might need additional encouragement when the insurance money actually arrived. "By now, you're probably wondering if you deserve this help," the letter began. "You're probably thinking about all the reasons you should use the money for something more practical, more responsible, more in line with what other people would expect. Ignore those thoughts. This money exists because I loved you, and love doesn't require justification or explanation. Use it to take care of whatever needs taking care of, and don't apologize to anyone for accepting grace when it comes." The letter was signed with her full name, Mary Catherine Carter, in the careful script she used for important documents. Below her signature, she'd added a postscript. "P.S. If you're reading this while caring for some stray animal you've rescued, I'm not surprised. You always did have a soft spot for creatures that needed looking after. They're lucky to have. Who found you?" Eli folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket alongside the wooden cross and her photograph. Mary had known him better than he'd known himself, had understood that his response to grief would be to seek purpose in caring for others who couldn't care for themselves. The weekend passed with careful preparation for Hope's surgery. Dr. Chen had provided detailed instructions about preoperative care: no food after midnight Sunday, limited water. Monday morning, gentle transport to minimize stress on the injured paw. Marcus and Grace seemed to sense the approaching change, their behavior becoming more protective and attentive toward Hope. The pack had developed its own communication system over the weeks together, subtle signals and positioning that allowed them to coordinate responses without obvious commands from Eli. Sunday evening brought an unexpected visitor. Doug Mencken arrived in his white pickup truck, stepping carefully across the icy debris field in leather shoes that weren't designed for such terrain. His usual confident demeanor seemed subdued, and he approached their shelter with less swagger than Eli remembered from their previous encounters. "Carter," he said, nodding toward the improved shelter and the 3 dogs who had positioned themselves in protective formation. "Heard you were still here." 2 weeks aren't up yet," Eli replied, not bothering to stand from his position beside Hope. "About that," Mencken shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "I've got development plans moving forward for this property. Surveyors coming next month. Contractors by spring. Going to need this area cleared." "I understand. The thing is..." Mencken paused, looking at Hope with an expression that might have been guilt or simply discomfort. "The injured one, how's it doing?" "Surgery tomorrow. She's going to be fine." "Good. That's good." Mencken pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Look, I may have been hasty about the price when you wanted to buy them. Professional. Trainers never showed up, and I'm not in the dog business anyway. Consider this a refund for the difference." The envelope contained $500 in cash, not the full difference between what Eli had paid and the dog's supposed value, but more money than Eli had seen in one place since Mary's death. "Why?" Eli asked. Mencken looked around the improved shelter, taking in the careful arrangement of salvaged materials and the obvious care that had gone into creating livable space from industrial debris. "Maybe because you actually wanted them for the right reasons. Maybe because I remembered that I took your house. And giving you a fair deal on the dogs doesn't make us even, but it doesn't make things worse either." He turned to leave, then paused. "Property development's going to happen regardless, but if you need time to find somewhere else to go, we can work something out. January, maybe, before the heavy equipment arrives." After Mencken left, Eli sat in the gathering darkness with the $500 spread across his lap and Hope pressed against his side. $800 from the insurance settlement plus $500 from Mencken's unexpected conscience meant $1,300 for rebuilding a life after Hope's surgery costs were covered. It wasn't wealth, but it was possibility. Enough for a security deposit on a small apartment. Enough for proper clothes and basic necessities. Enough to begin the process of rejoining the world of people who had addresses and phone numbers and normal relationships with bureaucracy. Marcus returned from his evening patrol and settled into guard position, while Grace arranged herself to monitor both the interior space and Hope's breathing. The pack had learned to function as a unit, each member contributing to their collective security and well-being. That night, Eli dreamed of Mary for the first time since acquiring the dogs. She appeared as she had during their last Christmas together, wearing the red sweater and smiling with the warmth that had sustained him through 25 years of marriage. "You did good," she said in the dream, reaching out to touch Hope's sleeping form. "They chose well when they chose you." "I didn't know what I was doing," Eli admitted. "Still don't, really." "Nobody does," Mary replied. "That's what makes it brave." Monday morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for travel to Dr. Chen's clinic. Pastor Williams arrived early with the pickup truck, and they loaded Hope into the cab with careful attention to the pup's comfort. Marcus and Grace rode in the truck bed, their alert postures suggesting they understood this journey was different from routine trips to town. At the clinic, Dr. Chen reviewed the surgical procedure, one final time, explaining the risks and expected recovery timeline. Hope would need to stay overnight for monitoring, then return home with restrictions on activity and a schedule of follow-up appointments. "She's young and healthy despite the injury," Dr. Chen assured him. "Recovery should be straightforward, if you can keep her calm and prevent her from overexerting the surgical site." As the veterinary team prepared Hope for surgery, Eli felt the weight of decision-making that had characterized the entire rescue experience. Every choice had led to this moment, trading his boots for 3 dogs, refusing to abandon them when circumstances became difficult, using Mary's insurance money for veterinary care rather than personal necessities. But sitting in the clinic's waiting room with Marcus and Grace flanking his chair, Eli understood that these hadn't been sacrifices but investments, not in the dogs' futures, but in his own redemption from the hollow existence that had consumed him since Mary's death. The surgery would succeed or fail based on Dr. Chen's skill and Hope's resilience. But regardless of the outcome, the decision to try represented a fundamental shift in how Eli understood his place in the world. He was no longer a man who had lost everything, surviving on the margins of a community that had no place for his grief. He was a pack leader, responsible for creatures who depended on his judgment and determination. The difference might seem subtle to outside observers, but to Eli, it felt like the difference between drowning and swimming, the same water, but entirely different relationships with the possibility of reaching shore. The surgery took 3 hours and 47 minutes, each minute stretching like an elastic band under tension. Eli sat in the waiting room with Marcus and Grace pressed against his legs, their warm weight a constant reminder that Hope's recovery would affect more than just one injured pup. Dr. Chen had explained the procedure in detail. They would re-break the improperly healed bones in Hope's paw, align them correctly, and insert titanium pins to maintain proper positioning during the healing process. The pins would remain permanently, creating a framework strong enough to support normal activity once recovery was complete. Through the waiting room's single window, Eli watched ice crystals form patterns on the glass, while Marcus occasionally stood to pace the small space, his anxiety manifesting in restless energy that Grace countered with maternal calm. The older female seemed to understand that emotional stability would be crucial for whatever came next. At 2:15 p.m., Dr. Chen emerged from the surgical suite, still wearing scrubs and the focused expression of someone who'd been performing delicate work under pressure. Her smile was tired but genuine as she approached Eli's chair. "The surgery went well," she announced, and Eli felt 3 weeks of tension release from his shoulders like air escaping from an overfilled balloon. We were able to correct the alignment and install the pins without complications. Hope's going to need 6 weeks of restricted activity, but she should make a full recovery. Can I see her? She's still coming out of anesthesia, but yes, just keep in mind that she'll be groggy and possibly disoriented for the rest of the day. Hope lay on a blanket in the recovery area, her injured paw wrapped in white bandages that looked impossibly clean against the dingy fur that spoke of weeks living in industrial debris. The pup's breathing was steady but shallow, and her eyes remained closed, despite Eli's gentle voice calling her name. Marcus and Grace approached carefully, their noses working to process the unfamiliar smells of antiseptic and anesthesia that clung to their pack member. Both adults seemed to understand that Hope was injured, but healing rather than in immediate danger. The pins are surgical-grade titanium, Dr. Chen explained, showing Eli the X-rays that revealed the metal framework now supporting Hope's reconstructed paw. Strong enough to last a lifetime, biocompatible, won't set off metal detectors if that ever becomes relevant. The pins looked like tiny silver threads in the ghostly image, impossibly delicate yet strong enough to transform Hope's future from one of chronic pain to normal mobility. Eli stared at the X-ray, understanding that he was looking at the physical representation of possibility, metal and bone working together to create something neither could achieve alone. When can she come home? Tomorrow morning, if there are no complications. She'll need pain medication for the first week, antibiotics to prevent infection, and absolutely no running or jumping until I clear her for normal activity. The ride back to Millfield was quiet, except for the truck's engine and the wind whistling through gaps in the cab's weather ceiling. Marcus and Grace rode in the bed with stoic acceptance of the cold, while Eli sat in the passenger seat processing the reality that Hope's surgery had been successful. Pastor Williams seemed to understand that conversation wasn't necessary, driving with the comfortable silence of someone who'd spent years counseling people through crisis and recovery. Only when they reached the cannery did he speak. "Good news travels fast in a small town," he said. "Rita mentioned she might have some job opportunities if you're interested. Part-time kitchen help, nothing glamorous, but honest work that pays enough to cover basics." Work. The concept felt foreign after 3 years of survival-focused scavenging, but also appealing in ways Eli hadn't expected. The structure of employment, the social interaction, the simple satisfaction of completing tasks that had value to other people, all things he'd taken for granted during his construction years. "I'll talk to her," Eli promised. That evening, as they settled into their shelter without Hope, for the first time since forming their pack, Marcus and Grace displayed obvious anxiety about their missing member. Both adults repeatedly checked the entrance and explored corners where Hope usually rested, their behavior confirming that the pack's bonds had strengthened beyond simple proximity. Eli found himself explaining Hope's absence aloud, describing the surgery and promising the pup's return the following day. Whether the dogs understood his words or simply responded to his tone, both seemed to relax as he spoke, eventually settling into their usual sleeping positions despite the disruption to their routine. The night passed slowly, punctuated by Marcus getting up to patrol their perimeter and Grace repositioning herself to maintain visual contact with both Eli and the entrance. The pack's security protocols had adapted to accommodate Hope's absence, but the underlying tension was palpable. Tuesday morning brought the kind of crystalline winter air that made every breath visible and turned the world into a landscape of sharp edges and brilliant light. Eli woke before dawn, his internal clock adjusted to Dr. Chen's schedule for Hope's discharge from the veterinary clinic. Marcus and Grace seemed to sense the significance of the day, both adults displaying restless energy that spoke of anticipation mixed with anxiety. They had spent the night alternating between their usual guard positions and checking the corners where Hope typically rested, their behavior confirming that the pack's bonds extended far beyond simple convenience. The walk to town felt different with only 2 dogs instead of 3. Marcus ranged ahead with more urgency than usual, while Grace maintained closer contact with Eli, as if understanding that pack cohesion was more fragile when members were absent. The rhythm they'd developed over weeks of traveling together had been disrupted by Hope's surgery, and all 3 felt the imbalance. Pastor Williams was waiting with the pickup truck when Eli arrived at the Methodist church, steam rising from a travel mug of coffee in his hands. The pastor had become more than just a helpful neighbor. He'd evolved into something approaching family, one of the few people who understood the weight of what Eli was trying to accomplish. "How are you holding up?" Williams asked as they loaded Marcus and Grace into the truck bed. "Better than I expected," Eli admitted, worried about how Hope will handle the recovery, but grateful the surgery went well. The drive to Riverside took 40 minutes through countryside that looked like a Christmas card. Snow-covered fields, bare trees outlined against pale sky, farmhouses sending thin columns of smoke into the still air. It was the kind of beauty that Mary used to point out during their drives together, her appreciation for small, visual pleasures, having taught Eli to notice details he might otherwise have missed. At Dr. Chen's clinic, Hope was awake but subdued, her usual enthusiasm dampened by lingering effects of anesthesia and the unfamiliar sensation of bandages around her paw. The pup's tail wagged weakly when Eli entered the recovery area, but she remained lying down rather than attempting her usual excited greeting. "She's doing well," Dr. Chen reported, checking Hope's vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Pain levels are manageable, no signs of infection, and the surgical site looks good. She'll be sleepy for the rest of the day, but that's normal, and actually helpful for keeping her calm." Marcus and Grace approached Hope carefully, their noses working to process the clinical smells that still clung to her fur. Both adults seemed to recognize their pack member, despite the medical odors. Grace positioning herself protectively, while Marcus investigated the bandaged paw with gentle curiosity. "The medication schedule is straightforward," Dr. Chen continued, handing Eli a bag containing bottles of pills and detailed instructions. "Pain medication twice daily with food, antibiotics once daily for 10 days. She can walk short distances for bathroom breaks, but no running, jumping, or rough play until I clear her." Hope stood carefully when Eli called her name, favoring the bandaged paw, but moving with more confidence than she'd shown in weeks. The surgical correction had already improved her balance, even with the restrictions imposed by recovery requirements. The ride home became a celebration of sorts, with Hope settled between Eli and Pastor Williams, while Marcus and Grace rode in the truck bed with obvious relief at having their pack reunited. Hope remained sleepy but alert, her head resting on Eli's lap while her tail tapped occasionally against the seat. "Rita wants to talk with you about the job opportunity," Williams mentioned as they approached Millfield. "She's been short-handed since her cook quit last month. Nothing fancy, but steady hours and decent pay for someone who shows up reliable." Back at the cannery, Hope explored their shelter with careful steps, reacquainting herself with familiar smells and spaces, while Marcus and Grace maintained protective positions nearby. The bandaged paw clearly felt different, but Hope seemed to understand instinctively that the change represented improvement rather than additional injury. That afternoon brought the moment Eli had been anticipating since Dr. Chen first explained the surgical procedure. Hope took her first tentative steps without the pronounced limp that had characterized her movement for months. The paw still required careful placement and couldn't bear full weight, but the fundamental misalignment had been corrected. "Look at that," Eli said softly, watching Hope navigate across their makeshift floor with something approaching normal gait. "You're going to be able to run again." Hope's response was to settle beside him with a contentment he hadn't seen since their first meeting at the rusted cage. The pup's breathing was relaxed, her posture suggesting relief from the chronic discomfort that had defined her existence before surgery. As evening approached, the pack settled into their recovery routine, with Hope receiving extra attention from both adult dogs and modified sleeping arrangements to accommodate her healing paw. Marcus and Grace positioned themselves to provide warmth and security while allowing Hope easy access to water and food. The space heater hummed quietly in the background, creating a pocket of warmth that made their industrial shelter feel almost homelike. Outside, wind rattled their metal barriers and sent cold drafts through gaps in their defenses. But inside their carefully constructed nest, the pack rested with the security that comes from having survived the hardest part of a difficult journey. Eli checked Hope's bandages one final time before settling down for the night, the pup's steady breathing and relaxed posture confirming that the surgery had achieved its intended purpose. The titanium pins were invisible beneath fur and bandages, but their presence represented a transformation as complete as any magic. Damaged bones made whole, chronic pain eliminated, normal life restored through the simple application of medical knowledge and surgical skill. In his pocket, Mary's photograph and the wooden cross pressed together like talismans of different faiths united by common purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Hope continued healing and their pack adapted to permanent changes in their circumstances. But tonight, for the first time since discovering 3 dogs in a rusted cage, Eli fell asleep, knowing that his most important decision had been vindicated by measurable success. 6 months later, Eli Carter stood in the backyard of a small rental house on the outskirts of Millfield, watching Hope chase a tennis ball with the boundless energy of a young dog who had never known limitation. The pup's gait was perfect now, no trace of the limp that had once defined her movement, no hesitation before jumping or running or simply being young. The house wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that barely accommodated a small table, but it had a fenced yard where the dogs could run safely and a wood-burning stove that kept them all warm during the harsh winter months that had followed Hope's surgery. More importantly, it belonged to them, in the way that earned spaces always do, through daily investment of care and attention and the simple satisfaction of having somewhere to return each evening. Rita's diner had provided the foundation for their new stability. The work was exactly as advertised, nothing glamorous, just washing dishes and prep cooking and the occasional shift waiting tables when Rita needed extra help. But the paychecks were steady, the hours were reasonable, and Rita had proven to be the kind of employer who valued reliability over credentials. You show up when you say you will, you work hard while you're here, and you don't create drama, she'd told him during his first week. That's more than I can say for half the people I've hired over the years. The routine had become second nature. Wake before dawn, feed the dogs and let them out into the yard, walk to work while they settled into their morning patrol of their territory, return home in the late afternoon to find 3 tails wagging by the back door. Simple pleasures that had once seemed impossible when survival consumed every hour of every day. Marcus had appointed himself guardian of their property, marking boundaries and investigating visitors with the thoroughness of a professional security system. His territorial instincts had found proper expression in protecting something that actually belonged to them, rather than simply defending temporary shelter from inevitable eviction. Grace had claimed the front porch as her observation post, spending hours watching the neighborhood with the serene attention of someone who'd finally found a place worth monitoring. Her maternal instincts extended to every delivery driver, neighbor child, and stray cat that wandered within her range of concern. But it was Hope's transformation that provided the most visible evidence of how far they'd all traveled from that morning when Eli had discovered 3 dogs in a rusted cage. The pup had grown into her promise, developing the intelligence and athleticism that proper breeding and nutrition could produce when combined with security and affection. This evening, as spring air carried the scent of growing things and longer days, Hope demonstrated the results of Dr. Chen's surgical skill by executing a perfect flying catch that would have been impossible with her old injury. The titanium pins were invisible now, integrated so completely with bone and muscle that even veterinary examinations could barely detect their presence. "She looks happy," Pastor Williams observed, settling into one of the lawn chairs Eli had salvaged and repaired during their first month in the house. "They all do," Eli agreed, watching Marcus investigate a suspicious rustling in the hedge while Grace supervised from her porch position. "Hard to believe it's the same pack that was barely surviving in that industrial wasteland." Williams had become a regular visitor, stopping by most evenings to share coffee and conversation and the simple pleasure of watching 3 dogs who'd found their purpose. His help during their crisis had evolved into genuine friendship, the kind that develops between people who've seen each other handle difficult circumstances with grace. "Got something for you," Williams said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Came to the church, addressed to you, care of my office." The return address was unfamiliar, Bradley Properties, Clearwater, Florida, but the handwriting on the envelope looked elderly, careful in the way that suggested arthritis or other physical limitations affecting fine motor control. Inside was a letter from Margaret Bradley, daughter of Tom Bradley, who'd owned the grocery store that had closed 3 years earlier. She'd heard about Eli's situation through the network of connections that linked small towns across vast distances, former residents who maintained contact with people they'd left behind. "My father always spoke highly of you," the letter began. "He remembered you as someone who'd helped him with repairs around the store, never accepting payment even when we knew you needed the money. When he passed last month, he left instructions about a small property he'd owned on Oak Street. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom house with a yard, but he wanted it to go to someone who'd appreciate what he was trying to provide." The letter included a deed transfer and keys to a house Eli remembered from his construction days, a solid little building he'd actually helped renovate 15 years earlier before his world collapsed into medical bills and grief. Tom Bradley had apparently purchased it as rental property, but never found tenants who met his exacting standards for care and maintenance. "The house is yours if you want it," Margaret's letter continued. "No payment required. Just take care of the place and remember that good people sometimes get second chances when they need them most." Eli stared at the deed, reading his name typed in official legal language that made the impossible suddenly concrete. Home ownership, property taxes, responsibility for maintenance and insurance. All the burdens and privileges of belonging somewhere. "And permanently? What's it say?" Williams asked, though his expression suggested he'd already guessed the general content. "Tom Bradley left me a house." "Tom always was perceptive about character," Williams said, with the satisfied tone of someone who'd seen justice served in unexpected ways. "Probably figured you'd earn some luck after the way you've handled these past months." That evening, as the pack settled into their established routine of security patrols and comfortable positions around the living room, Eli sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread before him and Mary's photograph propped against a coffee mug. The little dog, who'd chosen him by pressing her paw through the bars of a rusted cage, now slept peacefully on a cushion by the back door, her breathing deep and regular with the contentment that comes from knowing tomorrow will bring familiar routines and people who care about her well-being. The wooden cross from the cannery debris sat on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, catching morning light each day as a reminder that faith sometimes requires nothing more complicated than refusing to abandon hope when circumstances seem impossible. Outside, spring evening sounds drifted through open windows, neighborhood children playing, birds settling into evening roosts, the distant hum of traffic on roads that led to places where other people were building lives from whatever materials they could find. 6 months ago, Eli had been a man with nothing to lose because he'd already lost everything that mattered. Tonight, he was a pack leader, a homeowner, a member of a community that had room for damaged things learning to be whole again. The transformation hadn't happened suddenly or dramatically, but through daily decisions to care for others who needed, caring for, to show up when showing up mattered, to trust that doing the right thing would eventually lead to better outcomes than doing the easy thing. Hope stirred in her sleep, tail tapping against her cushion as dreams carried her through. Adventures that no longer required accommodation for injury or limitation. In the morning, she would wake ready for another day of tennis balls and territorial patrols, and the simple satisfaction of belonging somewhere that felt like home. And Eli would wake ready to provide whatever care and protection his pack required, understanding finally that being needed by others had saved him from the slow dissolution that follows great loss. The dogs had chosen well when they'd chosen him, but the choice had been mutual, damaged souls recognizing in each other the possibility of healing that comes not from forgetting pain, but from finding purpose beyond it.